What if the person you believed to be your acquaintance had made sacrifices throughout their life that you could never have predicted? This funeral altered everything at Green Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery's crowd stood respectfully, whispering quietly around the recently excavated grave. Among the mourners, an elderly black woman stood out, though unintentionally, as her deep green dress flowed modestly around her, and her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath the polished black headstone that gleamed in the afternoon sun and was engraved with the words, "A life of service and sacrifice." A mixture of family members, friends, and acquaintances had gathered to pay their respects to Thomas Langley, a man revered for his charitable work and warm presence in the community. A basic at her hands were steady, as she held a single crimson rose, but her eyes showed a weight of. Feeling far more intense than those around her, she stood at the edge of the crowd, silent as others exchanged pleasantries, and few acknowledged her. Her presence was both commanding and subdued, and it wasn't until the pastor finished his final prayer that she slowly moved forward, making her way to the front. The only sound she heard was the crunch of gravel beneath her heels as the mourners parted to make room for her. When she arrived at the grave, she paused to gaze down at the polished casket before carefully placing the rose on top, and faced the throng. Her name is Millie DeLay, and she spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I'm not sure how many of you know me, but I knew Thomas better than anyone." A wave of shock went through the crowd, and everyone's faces turned to each other. Their brows furrowed, their mouths whispered in interest. Who was this woman, and how could she claim to have such a close relationship with a man they all assumed they knew so well? With a serene yet determined smile, Millie's eyes swept across the sea of faces. She continued, "Before today ends, you'll understand why I'm here, and you'll understand the Thomas Langley." Her words lingered in the air thick with an implicit promise. But what Millie was going to reveal would cause everyone to reevaluate everything they believed to be true about the man they had come to respect. The crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering in their eyes as Millie Drew took a deep breath. Her voice carried a calm authority that compelled everyone to listen. "I met Thomas 50 years ago." She started looking off into the distance, as if the memories were playing before her. "At that time, it wasn't here in this town, but rather in Montgomery, Alabama, when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." Millie continued, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "He was an ambitious and driven teacher, but his passion was in the civil rights movement, which is where we met. He wasn't scared to stand by me on the steps of a church where we were hosting gatherings, even if it meant receiving threats or losing his job." The group gasped as they realized that although they had known Thomas to be polite and giving, they had never heard of his involvement in these conflicts. After allowing her words to settle, Millie continued, her voice softening. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice. We were friends, no more than friends. We became each other's family. He supported me when I lost my sister to the savagery of those times, when it seemed like the world was out to destroy us. He called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it aloud." The crowd shifted uneasily, the gravity of her words sinking in. It was difficult to reconcile this image of Thomas with the man they knew, a polished philanthropist who had quietly helped many but never spoke of his own. "And I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being shunned by his own." Millie's hand trembled a little as she adjusted her hat, her eyes fixed on the coffin, and we shared meals, stories, and tears. Struggles, but she stated in a louder voice, "What I'm telling you isn't just about. The past is about the man he became as a result of those challenges." She stopped and looked around the room, allowing the stillness to last just long enough. But Millie's next words would transcend their relationship and lift the curtain on sacrifices that none of them could have predicted. Millie looked at the crowd, her piercing eyes meeting theirs, as if she were saying, "I didn't just survive the times we fought through them, but that fight demanded sacrifices that left marks on both of us, marks most of you would never see." Her hands were clenched tightly around her purse, and her voice was unwavering as she spoke. In 1967, challenging anyone to turn away, Thomas was fired by the school board for participating in a Selma march. When my own house was firebombed in retaliation for holding meetings, Thomas arrived in the middle of the night with his car and drove me and my 2 nephews to safety. It was unworthy behavior, but we all knew what it really was: retribution. He didn't tell anyone here about it because he didn't want sympathy. He packed up what he had and moved to a small 1-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery, where he lived, making ends meet by taking tutoring jobs. Millie's voice cracked slightly as she went on. Knowing full well the danger, she turned back to the coffin without hesitation. Her face the crowd stood in silence, enthralled as she took a folded piece of paper from her purse and said, holding it up, is a letter Thomas wrote to me in 1972. I want to read just one part to you. She unfolded the letter carefully, her hands shaking just enough to demonstrate how much it meant to her, and she started reading aloud, her voice trembling but clear. Softening, that's who Thomas was. Not the polished man in the tailored suit most of you remember, but someone who walked through fire for the people he cared about. You are the sister I selected, Hattie. We have shared burdens that no one should have to bear, but I would shoulder them again for you without. The audience, which had been so stoic, changed visibly as she finished speaking, with some wiping at their eyes and others staring at the ground in embarrassment at not knowing this side of the man they had come to honor. Millie said, folding the letter again, not even when it cost him everything, and yet how many of you were present? You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back. How many of you were interested enough to inquire? She let the question linger in the middle of her statement. Pressing on the air seemed heavier as Millie continued to speak, her words filled with both grief and defiance. There's one more truth about Thomas, a truth none of you have guessed, but that shaped everything he stood for. The crowd tensed, hanging on her every word as she took a steadying breath. However, as the truth of Thomas's sacrifices set in, Millie revealed something even more profound, an act of courage that would redefine his legacy forever. Thomas fought a battle no one could win, not only for others. For years, he concealed the fact that he was providing for a boy he was unable to publicly claim due to the mother's identity. A group gasp that echoed across the group. His son Samuel was born to a woman Thomas was unable to marry due to the time and location they lived in. The boy was black like me, and Thomas was compelled to keep it a secret out of concern for the impact it would have on his reputation and career in some circles. Millie's eyes swept the shocked faces, but she pressed forward without hesitation. The whispers became louder, and people were now exchanging shocked looks, but Millie wasn't done. She continued gently, I was there when Samuel was born, and Thomas made sure the boy never left. Under the guise of darkness, he visited whenever he could, wrote letters weekly, and paid for his education without. Made sure Samuel had all he had never had as a child, a father's love, even if it had to be a quiet one. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained strong, and Samuel, the man you didn't know existed, arrived today. A tall man with broad shoulders and a quiet dignity in his movements stepped forward from the back of the crowd, and the crowd turned to stare in stunned silence. Samuel approached Millie and gently put a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, he said softly, his voice full of passion, and Millie grinned at him through it all. Her emotions, saying, it was always my honor. She then turned back to the group and spoke to them again. I'm here today to make sure you know the actual guy behind all the accolades, because although Thomas loved you all in his own way, his greatest love was for those of us who didn't have the privilege of being recognized in polite society. Not only was there astonishment in the ensuing hush, but there was also introspection and a reckoning with the reality that had been concealed in plain sight but before the grieving could thoroughly comprehend what they had discovered. Millie had one last tale to tell about a brave moment that would characterize Thomas's. All eyes were on Samuel, who stood tall and resolute next to Millie. His presence was a living testament to the secrets Thomas had carried. An older man near the front of the group cleared his throat, breaking the stillness, with a voice I never knew he stammered. Legacy, forever. The crowd stood frozen, the weight of Hattie's words settling over them like a blanket too heavy to shake off. Hattie's eyes softened as she gazed at Thomas, who never mentioned any of this. When my father lost his job, he helped my family, she said quietly. I thought I understood his kindness, but now it feels so much deeper. He wasn't the type of man to seek praise for doing what was right, she said, but make no mistake, he carried the weight of these sacrifices every single day. A middle-aged woman, her face strewn with tears, stepped forward hesitantly. Millie nodded, her voice steady but expressive. Thomas didn't simply succumb to. He provided convenience because he knew what it meant to be without, and he never wanted anyone to experience that same suffering. The group started to bring back shards of their own memories of Thomas. Each story told depicted a man whose strength and generosity were derived from a life that few of them had fully comprehended. But it wasn't just the memories that lingered. Many people realized they had only ever known the polished version of Thomas, the man who used his success as a shield to conceal the truth of his struggles. A young man near the back finally spoke up, his voice shaking with. Feeling it's unfair, he murmured, straining his fists. He should have been commended for everything, not just the sections we were interested in seeing. Thomas wasn't a man who worried about credit. Instead, he cared about impact, and his greatest legacy isn't the plaques on the walls or the awards in your programs. Rather, it's the lives he impacted. Millie turned to face him, her face softening as she replied, You're right. Mine, yours, and Samuel's moved forward, and his voice was firm but quiet. My father used to tell me that a person's worth is determined by their legacy, not by the things they left behind, and as I stand here now, I realize that he left behind more than I could have ever dreamed. As their collective guilt gave way to a greater comprehension of the man they had come to meet, the audience appeared to breathe. Tears flowed freely to mourn, not only because of Thomas's death, but also because of the profound realization of his unseen sacrifices. However, as the crowd started to grasp the full weight of Thomas's life, Millie was ready to share one last story that would forever alter them. Millie took a moment to gather herself, her hands clasped tightly together, and she looked out at the crowd. The air was heavy not just with grief, but also with a newfound respect for the man they believed they had known. But there was still one more story she needed to tell. 2 months before to his death, Thomas committed the last act of his life that would define his legacy. She started speaking more softly, and then he called to tell me that although he wasn't feeling well, his spirit had not changed. He explained that he was creating a trust for the kids in this neighborhood, kids whose parents are struggling to make ends meet, kids who should have opportunities but are frequently. He knew he wouldn't survive to witness the trust in action, but he didn't care that Millie's voice broke a little as she continued to speak. He ignored the throng, which surged once more with emotions of surprise and wonder. For him, what was important was sowing the seed with the intention that it would flourish long after he was gone. Samuel took a deep step forward. Voice confirming his mother's assertions that trust is genuine, he stated resolutely that it has already been founded and will offer scholarships, mentorship, and after-school activities for underprivileged children. My father wished for his life to have significance for future generations as much as for the individuals he knew. Thomas's greatest gift, according to Millie, was to meet each mourner's eyes with her gaze. She claimed he didn't need praise or acknowledgement, only to know that he had contributed to a slightly better world. After she finished speaking, there was a prolonged pause as her words sank into the hearts of everyone in attendance. Some silently nodded, some wiped away their emotions, and some just stood motionless, deep in contemplation. If Thomas taught us anything, it's that the true legacy isn't written in stone, but rather in the hearts of the people you uplift. Millie put her hand on the polished headstone, her voice growing softer, but no less determined. So now I leave you with this. How will you be remembered? Not for the possessions you owned or the title you earned, but for the lives you touched and the love you gave. The crowd appeared to exhale collectively as the emotional weight gave way to quiet reflection. Had he offered giving Samuel one last nod before taking a step back to allow the occasion to calm down as the mourners started to scatter. Spoke to Millie and Samuel, thanking them and making promises to uphold Thomas's legacy. If this story touched you, let it remind you that sacrifice and kindness are often unseen but never overlooked. Keep in mind Thomas's advice to live a life that has a lasting impact on others. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us keep sharing stories like this one. The cemetery, which was once a place of solemn finality, has now been transformed into a place of renewed purpose.